My name is Innocent Batsani-Ncube. I'm a doctoral researcher in the African State Architecture Project, and today I'm joined by Gallagher, who is the principal investigator in the project, and we'll be talking about her article that was published in African Affairs recently. The article's title is State Aesthetics and State Meanings, Political Architecture in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you, IB.
My first question to you is, what motivated and inspired you to carry out this specific research in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire?
Travelling to both Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana and looking at some of their big state buildings and looking at how different they are. So these are two countries in West Africa which sit next to each other, and they have a lot in common in terms of their history, the kinds of agriculture they produce, their size, and the large component of ethnic overlap between the two countries. And if you go to the capital cities of each of the countries, you find extremely different flavour of the state, which is depicted through these state buildings. So in Ghana, you see a much more eclectic mix of buildings, including quite a lot of sort of colonial era buildings, quite a lot of buildings that were erected in the early post-independence era by Kwame Nkrumah, and then more recent buildings. Some of them have been funded by foreign donors. Some of them have been built using local resources. There's a real mixture. And in Côte d'Ivoire, on the other hand, you've got a sort of much more of a kind of curated collection of buildings, largely from the post-independence era of President Houphouët-Boigny. So the buildings look much more like a kind of curated, carefully put together collection. And they're much more sort of physically impressive. You know, there's a lot of big high-rise modernist architecture in Abidjan, which is the de facto capital. There's also an amazing buildings in the nominal capital, Yamoussoukro. But they're sort of very much more designed to impress. And so there's a very, very different flavour that comes from the two countries. And I was fascinated to think about what those buildings told us about the sort of flavour of the state in each country. Talking
about the flavour, and this is what I found quite interesting about your article, the way in which you then used this theoretical framework to study these buildings, drawing on art aesthetics in West Africa. I found that quite interesting and innovative, and so I would like you to tell me more about it in terms of how did you come to that, and how then did you find it useful in your overall research goal? As I was looking at architecture, it made sense to me to think about aesthetics. And there's a really fascinating literature on African art, particularly West African art and aesthetics. People writing about all sorts of art forms, about sort of traditional art forms like masks and objects, but also modern art, posters, paintings, films, music, the whole array. A lot of this literature was interested in ideas of the sublime. So ideas of what might be hidden, what might be otherworldly about art, what makes it powerful. And so it's not just about a kind of pleasing, something that you could enjoy looking at. In the literature is discussed the way in which art is actually made powerful by things that you can't necessarily see, that you either imagine or you remember because you've half glimpsed at something. There's much more, there's more layers to art that has a kind of aesthetic power than just the sort of surface level of what you see or hear. Some of it goes into discussion about the sublime. So the sublime meaning something which isn't necessarily even pleasing, but something which might be quite overwhelming or even frightening and alarming, and is definitely underwritten by something that's otherworldly. So often you might find this in the grandeur and the frightening nature of the natural world, but you also find it in other in sort of art forms and representations of them. Alongside that, a lot of the literature seems to talk about beauty as something which was a bit more prosaic, something a bit more organised, ordered, knowable. So you've got these two kinds of aesthetics, sort of aesthetic registers going on. One is about the kind of beauty, which is sort of knowable, organised, readable, and the other is the sublime, which is much more kind of powerful, but not nearly as legible. It's something which sits underneath and sort of exerts power in a more sort of nebulous and intangible way. Yeah, because this is what I found very interesting, that instead of saying beauty, ugly. You said beauty, sublime. In the paper, you mentioned that beauty and the sublime manifest in different ways in the discussion about the state buildings in both countries. Could you give me an example or two that illustrates this point?
Most of the research I did for the project was talking to people who live in Abidjan and in Accra, so the two capital cities. So it was not really about my own impressions of the buildings, but it was about what local citizens thought about them and sort of what they knew about them. It was really about how citizens read those buildings. And so talking to citizens in groups, so having discussions about these buildings, about what were the important buildings and what made them important and then getting people to describe them. There was a remarkable difference between the two countries. So in Ghana, the people that I spoke to were very much more inclined to see the buildings as sort of in a rather sort of practical, pragmatic term. They would understand, perhaps the origin, who built them, when they were built. They would understand what went on inside them. They would talk about that. They would talk about the decoration. They would talk about the quality of the fabric of the building. They might complain about, it's not modernized or it's a bit shabby. And they often talked as though they understood what the insides looked like, that they'd either been in or they could imagine being inside them. And that included buildings like the Parliament building. So people would talk about being inside the Parliament building and seeing the parliamentarians. Even if they hadn't necessarily been, they had a sense of it. To me, the register that they used on the whole most often was that of beauty, in the way that I've defined it. So that it was about what was legible, what made sense, what was sort of organised and rational, in a kind of fairly sort of graspable, and not necessarily the most exciting, but sort of a practical way. And then in Côte d'Ivoire, in contrast, you had much more emphasis on the sublime. So you had this sense of buildings that were barely describable. So people often used words like, it's a jewel, it's a gem, it's a remarkable building, we don't know how this could have happened. Very little discussion about what went on inside, very little sense of what happened underneath the surface of the building, but that they were remarkable, and that also that there were sort of associated stories, often of quite unpleasant, horrible associations, like, for example, that quite a lot of the buildings were built by migrant labourers from the region who died in accidents and were buried under the foundations. And so there was a sort of sense in which there was this kind of the dead bodies underneath the building. With Houphouët-Boigny as well, his presence being so much part of these buildings. Yes, he was more than a man. He was a remarkable person. He was sort of something, almost sort of, sometimes sort of almost connected to sort of godly-like qualities. But at the same time, that he had this sort of sense of subverting, of trickery, that he would, he introduced crocodiles in the lake around his palace in Yamoussoukro, and the crocodiles are quite terrifying, and they sometimes escape, and there was sort of stories about how he might have fed people to them, and sort of made sacrifices and so on. And there were quite a lot of really quite sort of uncanny, disturbing stories about these buildings, which were remarkable, but yet also had this kind of this ability to put the person off balance and to sort of feel quite intimidated by them. So it was much more of the sublime in Côte d'Ivoire and much more of the beauty in Ghana.
Looking at your findings, what would you say, you found most surprising?
I suppose I come from an academic background where we think that that political culture is very deeply embedded, and it takes, it develops over long durée. It's a very kind of long-term process, and I would expect to find, the way that people think about their institutions and their leaders to be different in different contexts. But two countries that are so close to each other and have so much in common, to be so different, made me question some of the assumptions I've made about, for example, the colonial experience being really quite profoundly transformative. And I suspect that the roots of some of this difference do lie in the colonial years, short though they were in that part of Africa, much shorter than in other parts of Africa. So, you're talking about less than 100 years of colonial rule, and yet it seems to have established a really quite profoundly different sort of idea of what the state is and what it looks like and what people feel about it. But also, I think really importantly, is the difference in the post-colonial leadership styles. So you have Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, who was very much, poetic, philosophical. His sort of focus was on something that was perhaps, artistically remarkable, and he made these astonishing buildings that were great statements, and statements not just in the country but to the region and the world. And then Kwame Nkrumah, who was no less charismatic and no less sort of grand in his ideas, and also, funnily enough, interested in architecture, but much more of a kind of technocratic approach to these things. And you have a more kind of practical ethos. You've got two countries which have been so dramatically shaped by relatively recent history, I think, and have gone into to produce two states that seem to me to be extremely different from each other. And I found that really fascinating and surprising.
Yeah. The idea of the colonial experience being quite important, maybe in shaping. If you look at what you found in both Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, to what extent do you think your contribution can be generalized to other African countries? Would you think that maybe, Côte d'Ivoire can be paradigmatic of maybe French colonies, or that would be simplistic, or is there a way of generalizing your findings to other African countries?
I suspect that there is quite a strong continuing legacy, and in fact you look at this in your own work. So some of the ways in which parliaments are assumed to need to work, sort of the ethos of what a parliament does. So for example, you do see very clearly in countries that were colonised by the British, parliaments matter more because in the British system they matter more, and in countries colonised by the French like Côte d'Ivoire, the parliament is less important than the presidency, and that echoes the Republican French approach. So I do think that actually this is something which you could find. But generalising across other countries, just coming back to the point about the article, the aesthetic approach that I developed in the article, I think provides a kind of way of a framework which you might read an aesthetic of the state. But I would suspect that in every state that you looked at, you would find a very, very different outcome of what that framework told you about the state. You would find different kinds of states in different countries, because I think they probably look very different everywhere you go.
Thank you so much for that, and we look forward to more work in that regard, particularly looking at the aesthetics of these days.
Thank you.